Summer, 1944. A road in Normandy, somewhere behind the American lines. A column of German prisoners is being marched toward a temporary holding area. They have been walking for hours. Their uniforms are crusted with mud and dried sweat. Several of them are scratching at lice bites beneath their collars. Most have not had a change of clothes in weeks. Some have not bathed since before the invasion. Their boots have not been dry since June. The column passes a bombed-out farmhouse, and the men at the front of the line see something that makes them slow down. An American military policeman waves them forward, but the prisoners are staring at a structure in the field to their left. It is a canvas enclosure, open at the top, rigged between two deuce-and-a-half trucks. Steam is rising from inside it. There is a line of American soldiers, perhaps 30 of them, standing outside the enclosure in their undershirts, waiting. Some are smoking, some are laughing. One of them is holding a towel. They are waiting for a shower, a hot shower, miles from the front line. The first group of Americans walks out the other side of the enclosure. Their hair is wet, their skin is pink from the hot water. They are being handed clean uniforms, clean socks, clean underwear, from a pile on a folding table manned by a quartermaster private who is sorting the clothes into 3 sizes, large, medium, and small, as casually as if he were working in a department store back in Ohio. The dirty uniforms the Americans walked in with are being bundled into canvas bags and loaded onto another truck that will take them to a semi-mobile laundry company somewhere behind the lines. The truck will return in 2 days with the clothes washed, dried, and folded. The German prisoners have not seen a system like this in their own army. They have never seen a system like this in any army. Their division's supply chains can barely deliver ammunition reliably. The idea that an army at war would devote trucks and fuel and manpower to transporting dirty laundry is so far outside their experience that they cannot process it as a military operation. It looks like something from civilian life. It looks like something that belongs in a city, not in a war zone. Scenes like this one played out across the European theatre throughout 1944 and 45. German prisoners marched past American supply dumps, stacked high with rations, fuel, clothing, and equipment, and they kept saying variations of the same thing. The version that survives in the official United States Army logistics history came from an unnamed German prisoner who looked at the mountains of material beside a road and said, "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." American interrogators heard versions of that sentence again and again from different prisoners in different holding areas for the rest of the war. The words changed. The disbelief did not. Because the question underneath the words was always the same. It is the question this entire investigation will try to answer. How is it possible that an army fighting a war, an army under fire, an army losing men every single day in the hedgerows and fields and roads of Normandy, was running hot showers for its soldiers within artillery range of the enemy? And the deeper question beneath that one, the one the German prisoners could feel but could not quite articulate. Why? Why would an army spend trucks, fuel, water, manpower, and time, all of them desperately scarce resources in a combat zone, on something as militarily useless as a hot bath? To understand why a German soldier standing on a road in Normandy could not comprehend what he was seeing, and to understand why what he was seeing would prove to be one of the most quietly decisive weapons of the entire war, we need to go back, not to D-Day, not to the planning for the invasion. We need to go back to a fundamental difference in how two nations understood what a soldier was, what a soldier needed, and what happened to an army that forgot the difference between hardness and strength. This is the story of how the United States Army, an army the Germans openly mocked as soft, as pampered, as incapable of enduring real hardship, used hot showers, clean socks, and hot coffee to help break the most feared fighting force on earth. And of how the army that believed suffering made warriors discovered, too late, that it only made corpses. The German military tradition that shaped the Wehrmacht's attitude toward soldier comfort was old, deliberate, and rooted in a single word: Härte, hardness. It was not a slogan. It was a worldview. It meant that the superior soldier was the one who could endure more than his enemy, the one who could march farther on less food, the one who could sleep in snow and fight the next morning without complaint, the one whose will was harder than the circumstances around him. This idea had deep roots. Frederick the Great's Prussian infantry had been trained to fear their officers more than the enemy. The logic was explicit. A soldier who had been hardened by brutal discipline would not break under fire because he had already been broken by something worse. By the time Helmuth von Moltke the Elder reformed the Prussian army in the 1860s, the philosophy had evolved beyond simple brutality, but the core premise remained. War was suffering. The army that could absorb more suffering without losing its ability to fight would win. When the Wehrmacht rebuilt itself in the 1930s, drawing on the foundation that men like Hans von Seeckt had laid during the Reichswehr years of the 1920s, and accelerating under the political pressure of the Nazi regime, Hymel became more than a military doctrine. It became a cultural requirement. Hitler himself, in speech after speech, demanded a German people that was hard, not soft. His telegram to the Hitler Youth in October 1944 called explicitly for unbending hardness. The ideal German soldier was the man who did not need comfort, who did not ask for comfort, and who despised comfort in others. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, perhaps the most admired German commander of the war, embodied this ethos personally. He ate what his men ate. He slept where his men slept. He believed, and said openly, that a commander must live under the same hardships as his troops. This was not propaganda. Rommel genuinely lived this way in North Africa and in France. His men respected him for it, and the principle behind it, that shared hardship-built unit, cohesion and fighting spirit, was not wrong. It had worked for the Prussian army. It had worked in Poland in 1939. It had worked in France in 1940. It had worked, spectacularly, in the opening campaigns in Russia in 1941. But there was a flaw in the philosophy that would not become visible until the war turned. The flaw was this. Hart assumed that willpower was a renewable resource, that a man who was cold, hungry, lice-ridden and exhausted could will himself to fight at the same level as a man who was warm, fed, clean and rested, that the body was merely the vehicle for the spirit, and that a strong enough spirit could override any physical deficit. The Americans held a different assumption. The Americans assumed that the body and the spirit were the same system, that you could not have one without the other, and that an army that took care of the machine would get more fighting out of the machine than an army that simply ran the machine until it broke. This was not a philosophical position the Americans arrived at through deep reflection. It was an engineering position, and it came from a country that thought about almost everything, including war, as an engineering problem. When the United States Army first met the Wehrmacht in combat, at a Tunisian mountain pass called Kasserine in February 1943, the Germans saw exactly what they expected to see. An army of amateurs. An army of soft, well-fed, over-equipped men who had never been under fire and who collapsed the moment they were. The result was a catastrophe for the Americans. 6,500 casualties in 5 days. Entire battalions scattered across 30 miles of desert. More than 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned. German analysts wrote reports that confirmed every preconception. The Americans were the dollar army. They had material wealth, but no martial spirit. They had trucks and tanks and canned rations, but they did not have the hardness that real war demanded. One German staff assessment circulated after Kasserine noted with undisguised contempt that American units had been found with quantities of personal comfort items, chocolate, cigarettes, toilet paper, and razor blades, that no German unit would have considered carrying into a combat zone. The implication was clear. An army that brought razor blades to a battlefield was not a serious army. This contempt ran deep, and it ran all the way to the top. Most senior German officers who had served on the Eastern Front, where their men had endured winters of -40 degrees and survived on frozen bread and horse meat, looked at the Americans as something close to a joke. They had seen what real war looked like. They had seen men fight until their fingers turned black from frostbite and keep fighting. The idea that an army which expected its soldiers to shave every morning could compete with men who had survived Stalingrad was, to them, absurd. What the German analysts did not understand, what they could not understand because their entire framework prevented them from understanding it, was that the razor blades were the point. Not the razor blades specifically, but what they represented. The Americans were not bringing comfort items to the battlefield despite being at war. They were bringing them because they were at war. Because somewhere in the vast institutional machinery of the United States Army, a decision had been made, not by a single general but by a culture, that a soldier who could shave was a soldier who could fight. That a soldier who had slept was more lethal than a soldier who had not. That a clean uniform was not a luxury, it was ammunition. That decision was about to scale to a degree that no army in history had ever attempted. When American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the men who hit the sand first carried rifles and grenades and Bangalore torpedoes. But behind them, in the vast logistics tail that was already being loaded onto ships before the first wave had even reached the shore, was something the German defenders had no category for. Behind the riflemen came the Quartermaster Corps, and the Quartermaster Corps had a plan for every single thing a human body needed to keep functioning under combat stress. The plan included food. Not just food, but hot food. The United States Army had made a doctrinal commitment, written into its regulations and enforced by its medical corps, that combat troops would receive hot, varied, nutritious meals as far forward as conditions permitted. The official Quartermaster history called it a subsistence philosophy. A food shortage in any American military unit, no matter how small, was regarded as a major emergency. The objective was to give the men in contact with the enemy hot, tasty, varied meals as soon as possible after the landings. This was not sentiment, it was science. The Army Medical Corps had studied the relationship between nutrition and combat performance and had concluded plainly that under heavy combat, exhausted men ate little of monotonous cold rations, became undernourished, and lost alertness and disease resistance. The only effective preventive measure to maintain the efficiency of men in combat for extended periods was to provide varied and appetizing meals prepared from fresh food and served hot. The technology for delivering hot food forward was simple but effective. The Marmite can, a 3-container insulated vessel whose design had been adapted from the French Marmite Norvégien, first recommended for the American Expeditionary Force in the First World War, could keep food hot for hours during transport by jeep or truck to positions near the front. Behind the Marmite cans were the field kitchens, one for every company, designed to feed 150 to 180 men. Behind the field kitchens were the bakery companies. Mobile bakeries, using British-designed equipment, began arriving in Normandy on June 30, 1944. Within 2 days, they were producing fresh bread at a rate of £40 per 100 rations. Over the entire European campaign, from D-Day to VE Day, 78.9% of all rations issued to American combat troops were kitchen-prepared A or B rations, not cold combat rations. By January and February of 1945, that figure reached 91%. The American Army was feeding its frontline soldiers hot, cooked meals 9 days out of 10. Think about what that number means in practical terms. It means that a sergeant in a foxhole outside Aachen, in November 1944, who had spent the morning under mortar fire and the afternoon clearing a building in which 2 of his men were hit, could expect, as the sun went down, to receive a Marmite can brought forward by a jeep driven by a mess sergeant who had driven it through areas that were still intermittently under fire. Inside the Marmite can would be something hot. Stew, maybe, or pork and beans, or creamed beef on toast, not restaurant food, not even particularly good food, but hot food, cooked food. Food that someone had taken the time to prepare in a field kitchen 3 miles behind the line and had then loaded onto a vehicle and driven forward to the men who needed it, because the United States Army had decided that hot food was not optional. A German sergeant in the same situation, in the same month, in a foxhole on the other side of the same town, was far more likely to be eating cold bread and canned meat, if he was eating at all. His supply system was collapsing. His ration party might not arrive. If it did arrive, it would likely bring cold food that had been cold for hours. But the food was only part of it. The part that seemed to stun German prisoners more than anything else, the part that kept coming up in interrogation reports and prisoner interviews and captured letters, was the showers. The job of keeping frontline soldiers clean belonged to a type of unit most people have never heard of, the Quartermaster Fumigation and Bath Company. The name sounds almost comical. It was not comical to the men who used it. Each fumigation and bath company operated 2 platoons. Each platoon ran a trailer fitted with 24 shower heads, later upgraded to 36. A single company, running at full capacity, could process 3,600 men in a 16-hour day. That was nearly enough to shower an entire infantry division in just over 4 days. The system required 20,000 gallons of clean water every day. The water had to be found, decontaminated, pumped into tanks, trucked to the site, and heated by portable units before being piped into the shower trailers. The men walked in filthy on one side. They stripped, they showered in hot water. They walked out the other side and were handed clean uniforms from a clothing exchange run by a supply section attached to the same unit. Their dirty clothes were bundled, tagged, and sent to a semi-mobile laundry company operating behind the lines. The clean replacement uniforms came from a revolving stock maintained by the same laundry units. Colonel McNamara, the 1st Army Quartermaster, understood both the value and the vulnerability of these units. On July 9, 1944, he detailed one platoon of the 863rd Fumigation and Bath Company to the 19th Corps with specific instructions. March the troops to the Bath Point rather than moving the Bath Point forward. Keep the conspicuous equipment out of artillery range. Conceal it from air observation. He was protecting an asset that he knew was as valuable, in its way, as an ammunition dump, because a soldier who had not bathed in 3 weeks was a soldier whose effectiveness was declining by the day. And McNamara, like every good quartermaster, measured effectiveness the way an engineer measures output. You cannot get more out of a machine by yelling at it. You get more out of a machine by maintaining it. At Homburg-Haute in France, one platoon of the 859th Quartermaster Fumigation and Bath Company served 1,500 men of the 80th Infantry Division every single day. The shower point was 8 miles from the front line. The men rotated back in groups, showered, received clean clothes, and returned to their positions. The 899th Semi-Mobile Laundry Company maintained a revolving stock of 2,000 clean uniform sets to keep the exchange running. When mobile shower equipment was not available, combat divisions improvised. According to the official Army Quartermaster history, the 1st Infantry Division Quartermaster Company captured a German sterilization unit, scrounged some pipe and a latrine screen, and built a portable shower from parts. The 4th Infantry Division built its own shower unit and mounted it on a 2.5-ton truck. On the northern flank, divisions on the line used shower facilities at coal mines and industrial sites near the front. The scale of the operation was enormous. By December 1944, the communications zone alone had 16 sterilization companies, 7 fumigation and bath companies, 78 fixed laundry sections, and 11.5 semi-mobile laundry companies deployed across the theatre. The 595th Quartermaster Laundry Company, supporting the 5th Corps, maintained 121% of rated capacity for 68 consecutive days. If your father or grandfather served with one of these quartermaster units, in the laundry companies, the bath companies, the bakery units, the graves registration teams, any of the unglamorous support units that kept the army alive and functioning, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. These men are almost never mentioned in the histories. They carried no rifles. They earned no combat decorations, but without them, the men who did carry rifles would have been too sick, too exhausted, and too broken to use them. Their service mattered. It deserves to be remembered. I want to tell you about one of those men. His name was Corporal Benjamin Berry. He served in the 863rd Quartermaster Fumigation and Bath Company. Before the war, he was an ordinary American from an ordinary town. After the war, he would return to an ordinary life. The army did not identify him as a future hero at his induction center. He was not an officer. He was not trained for command. He was trained to find water, heat it, and keep a shower unit running. Berry's company supported General George Patton's Third Army as it raced across France and into Belgium. His job was to locate local water sources, wherever the army happened to stop, and get the showers operational as quickly as possible. He recalled the frontline soldiers arriving at his unit haggard and dirty, some of them shaking, some of them with the blank stare that the medical corps was beginning to call combat exhaustion. They brightened up when they saw us, Berry said later. That sentence deserves a moment. They brightened up when they saw us. Not when they saw a tank battalion arriving as reinforcement. Not when they heard that air support was on the way. When they saw the shower trucks. When they saw clean clothes on a folding table and steam rising from a canvas enclosure in a field. That was what brightened them up. Berry was inducted into the Quartermaster Hall of Fame in 2002. His citation does not mention a single act of battlefield heroism. It mentions reliability. It mentions service. It mentions the thousands of men who walked into his shower unit carrying the weight of combat and walked out carrying a little bit less of it. Men like Benjamin Berry are the reason this story matters, not because a hot shower won the war, but because the decision to give a man a hot shower in the middle of a war, 8 miles from men who were trying to kill him, tells you something about the army that made that decision. It tells you what that army believed a soldier was worth. The German army believed a soldier was worth his willpower. The American army believed a soldier was worth a bar of soap, a clean pair of socks, and a cup of coffee. The question is, which belief produced more combat power? The answer is visible in the outcome of the war, but the mechanism deserves explanation. Where did this philosophy come from? It did not come from a single general. It did not come from a manual or a doctrine paper or a War Department memo, although all of those things eventually codified it. It came from the same place the American infantry's improvisational instinct came from. It came from the country itself. The United States in the 1930s and 1940s was a nation that thought about problems in terms of systems and engineering. When something broke, you fixed it. When a machine ran inefficiently, you redesigned the process. When a worker on a production line was underperforming, you did not tell him to try harder. You asked what was wrong with the line. The men who built the American logistics system for the Second World War brought this mentality with them from the factories and the farms and the businesses they had left behind. General Brayon Somervell, who commanded the Army Service Forces from 1942 to 1945, was a former Works Progress Administration engineer who had built LaGuardia Airport. He understood supply chains. He understood throughput and bottlenecks and inventory management. He understood that the decisive factor in any large operation was not the man at the front. It was the system behind the man at the front. He demanded ample supplies for the troops because he understood that supplies were not a luxury. They were the precondition for everything else. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, who ran the communications zone in the European theatre, the vast rear area organization responsible for moving everything from bullets to bath soap, from the ports to the front, operated one of the largest logistics enterprises in human history. By the spring of 1945, his organization was feeding, clothing, and otherwise providing necessities and comforts to millions of people across the theatre. That number included not just American soldiers but Allied troops, liberated civilians, and German prisoners of war. The official Army Quartermaster history described it as the largest human support operation by a single organization to that date, with the majority of the people being fed and clothed being non-Americans. The industrial machine behind these men was staggering. American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships during the war. The first one, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched on September 27, 1941. Early construction took 244 days per ship. By the height of production, the average had dropped to 42 days. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a record that has never been equaled. A single Liberty ship could carry 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition. This industrial power translated directly into battlefield abundance. The Red Ball Express, the emergency truck convoy system that fed the Allied advance across France, was conceived in an urgent planning session of roughly 36 hours and became operational on August 25, 1944. It was named after the old railroad term for priority freight. 2 parallel one-way highways, each restricted to military traffic, were designated between the beaches of Normandy and the advancing front lines near Paris. No civilian vehicles, no stops, no delays. Just trucks running around the clock in a continuous loop, loaded going east and empty going west. At its peak, 132 truck companies ran 5,958 vehicles. Approximately 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers, men from segregated transportation corps units, who drove 16, 18, sometimes 20 hours a day through blackout conditions on roads that were cratered by bombing and occasionally still under German air attack. These drivers have received far less recognition than they deserve. They did not carry rifles into combat. They carried the war itself, on the backs of their trucks, to the men who did. On August 29, 1944, the Red Ball Express carried 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots in a single day. That record went unmatched for the next 14 weeks. Colonel John S.D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son and himself a military historian, later assessed that without the Red Ball Express, the advance across France could not have been made. A single American division in combat consumed roughly 750 tons of supplies every day, about 100 pounds per man per day. That is not a misprint. 100 pounds of material per soldier per day, every day, for the duration of the campaign. Ammunition, food, fuel, water, medical supplies, clothing, spare parts, and yes, soap and towels and clean socks. But the detail that captures the philosophy, the detail that German prisoners kept coming back to with something between admiration and disbelief, was not the tonnage. It was the specificity. It was what the Americans chose to ship. The United States military operated 64 Coca-Cola bottling plants overseas during the war. 64. The program began on June 29, 1943, when a cablegram from General Eisenhower's headquarters requested materials and equipment for 10 bottling plants and 3 million filled bottles to be shipped to North Africa. By war's end, 148 Coca-Cola technical observers, the men the troops called Coca-Cola colonels, were operating those plants across every theatre. More than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola were consumed by military service personnel during the war. The United States Navy spent roughly $1 million to convert a concrete barge into a floating ice cream factory. The barge could produce 10 gallons every 7 minutes, roughly 500 gallons per shift. 3 such refrigerated barges were produced in all. In the Pacific, ice cream was one of the most reliable morale boosters available, and the Navy treated its production with the seriousness of an ammunition resupply. When a submarine returned from a war patrol in which it had sunk enemy shipping, the crew expected ice cream. When Marines came off the line after weeks of fighting on an island where temperatures reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the drinking water tasted like iodine, they expected ice cream. And they got it, because the Navy had decided that ice cream was worth $1 million barge. An army that ships Coca-Cola and ice cream to a combat zone is an army that has made a decision about what kind of war it is fighting. It is an army that has decided that morale is not a byproduct of victory. Morale is a precondition for victory, and morale is not sustained by speeches or medals or appeals to patriotism. It is sustained by the small physical comforts that remind a man under fire that someone, somewhere behind him, is thinking about whether he is thirsty. The German army had made the opposite decision, not because its leaders were stupid, and not because they did not care about their soldiers. Many German commanders cared deeply about their men. Rommel was one. But the system they served had made a philosophical choice that comfort was weakness, that hardship was strength, and that the correct response to a shortage of supplies was not to fix the supply chain, but to demand more endurance from the men. This was not just military doctrine, it was national culture. The Germany of the 1930s had been deliberately shaped into a society that despised softness. The Hitler Youth, which by 1939 had enrolled nearly every young man in the country, was built around physical endurance challenges, camping in rough conditions, long marches, and the explicit teaching that pain was something to be overcome through force of will. A generation of German soldiers arrived at the front having already been conditioned to believe that suffering was normal, and that complaining about suffering was a sign of moral weakness. The Japanese military held a similar philosophy, taken to an even more extreme degree, and the results were visible. At Guadalcanal, only roughly 20% of supplies dispatched by the Japanese Navy to its troops on the island actually reached the men. Of the roughly 30,000 Japanese soldiers committed to Guadalcanal, the vast majority who died were killed not by American bullets, but by starvation and tropical disease. As many as 3/4 of all Japanese deaths on the island came from non-combat causes. The Japanese High Command viewed this as a test of willpower rather than a failure of logistics. The men who starved were expected to keep fighting regardless. Many did. Most died. The American military looked at these examples and drew the opposite conclusion. Starving soldiers do not fight better. They fight worse. Cold soldiers do not fight better. They fight worse. Dirty soldiers do not fight better. They get sick, and sick soldiers do not fight at all. The American conclusion was simple, and it was backed by medical evidence, and it was implemented with industrial resources that no other nation on Earth could match. By 1944, this philosophy was being tested at scale, and the German system was failing. The Wehrmacht had never fully motorized. This fact, which is almost impossible to believe given the popular image of the German war machine as a fleet of panzers and half-tracks, is one of the most important and least understood facts of the Second World War. In 1943, of 322 German and SS divisions, only 52 were motorized. By November 1944, of 264 divisions, still active, only 42 were motorized. The German army relied on approximately 2.75 million horses and mules throughout the war. Each German infantry division in the early war period had roughly 5,300 horses and 1,100 horse-drawn vehicles, compared to only 950 motor vehicles. By 1944, divisions were down to about 4,600 horses, 600 motor vehicles, and 150 motorcycles. Historian Peter Caddick-Adams, in his study of the Battle of the Bulge, wrote that Hitler and the German High Command sent the 7th Army into the Ardennes in late 1944, essentially as it had been deployed in 1914, with its infantry marching on foot and horses dragging the same weapons it had used 30 years before. The food situation mirrored the transport situation. German rations declined steadily as the war dragged on. Average civilian ration card calories fell from 2078 in the winter of 1942 to 1943 to 1980 in 1943 to 1944 to 1670 in 1944 to 1945. German military rations were supposed to be better than civilian rations, but by late 1944 the food system had not been improved or modernized since the beginning of the war. Food often arrived cold. Sometimes little came. Sometimes nothing came at all, and soldiers went hungry for days at a time. German doctrine, to its credit, gave officers and enlisted men identical rations. There was no separate officers' mess, serving better food while the privates ate slop. That was a point of genuine pride. But pride does not replace calories. And by the winter of 1944, the calories were not there to replace. The hygienic situation was worse. Lice were endemic in German frontline units. Clean uniforms were rare. Bathing was infrequent at best. Trench foot, frostbite, and skin infections ravaged units that had no access to dry socks, clean boots, or warm water. The Wehrmacht had no equivalent of the American fumigation and bath companies. No mobile shower units, no clothing exchange system, no revolving stock of clean uniforms. A German frontline soldier in December 1944 might go weeks without a change of clothes and months without a proper bath. The medical consequences were devastating and measurable. A soldier infested with lice does not sleep properly. A soldier who does not sleep properly loses reaction time, loses judgment, loses the ability to make split-second decisions under fire. A soldier with trench foot cannot march. A soldier who cannot march cannot reposition, cannot retreat, cannot advance, cannot do the one thing that infantry exists to do. The American Army spent enormous resources on a systematic dry sock effort in the winter of 1944, pushing fresh, dry socks to every frontline soldier every day, because the medical corps had calculated that trench foot was causing more casualties in some divisions than German bullets. The Germans had no equivalent effort. Their soldiers wrapped their feet in whatever was available and kept walking until they could not walk anymore. The contrast between the two armies by that winter was visible to anyone with eyes, and the Germans had eyes. In the weeks before D-Day, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel told Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, his former Chief of Staff from the Afrika Korps, that the enemy they were about to face in France was fundamentally different from the Soviets in the East. He said that in the West they were facing an enemy who applied all his native intelligence to the use of his many technical resources, who spared no expenditure of material, and whose every operation went its course as though it had been the subject of repeated rehearsal. Rommel was describing, without quite naming it, the American logistics philosophy. He was describing an army that did not improvise its supply system. It engineered it. An army that did not hope its soldiers would be fed. It guaranteed it. An army that treated every element of soldier welfare, from ammunition to underwear, as a component in a machine that had been designed to produce a specific output. The output was combat power. And every hot shower, every clean uniform, every cup of coffee, and every bottle of Coca-Cola was a part of that machine. Bayerlein himself noted that most senior German officers had fought only in the East and regarded the British and Americans as comparatively incompetent in mobile warfare. They still thought of the Allies as soft. They were about to discover what the word soft actually meant when it was backed by 2,700 Liberty ships and 5,000 trucks running around the clock. Byerline had fought the Americans himself in North Africa. He knew better than most what they were capable of when they learned from their mistakes. He had watched the transformation from Kasserine to the final victory in Tunisia. He had seen the American army learn, adapt, and improve at a speed that no other army in the war matched. And he had seen something else. He had seen American units take losses that would have shattered a German unit of equal size, absorb replacements within days, and come back into the line as a functioning force. He attributed this partly to the replacements themselves, who arrived fed, rested, and equipped, and partly to the fact that the surviving men in the unit were in good enough physical condition to absorb the shock of losses and keep functioning. A unit that is well fed and rested can absorb a blow. A unit that is already starving and exhausted cannot. The American logistics system was not just keeping men comfortable, it was keeping units resilient. After the fall of France, after the retreats across Belgium, after the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the captured German soldiers who were marched past American supply dumps said variations of the same thing. The version that survives in the official United States Army logistics history came from an unnamed German prisoner who looked at the mountains of supplies stacked beside a road and said, "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." He meant it literally. The sheer weight of American material had crushed the German army, but he also meant something he probably could not have put into words. He meant that the supplies were not just physical objects, they were a statement of values. They were the physical expression of a nation that believed its soldiers deserved to be warm, and fed, and clean, and rested, and that this belief was not a distraction from fighting a war. It was how you fought a war. The military historian Martin van Creveld, in his landmark 1982 study Fighting Power, drew the sharpest distinction between the two systems. He argued that German military doctrine almost exclusively emphasized operations, meaning tactics, maneuver, and fighting spirit. American doctrine balanced operations, organization, and logistics. The Germans prized willpower, character, and personal responsibility. The Americans prized knowledge, management, and material. Van Creveld was careful to note that the German system produced, man for man, a more effective combat soldier in many measurable ways. A German rifle company in 1944 was probably a more dangerous tactical unit than an American rifle company of the same size. German soldiers fired more accurately. German small unit tactics were better rehearsed. German NCOs had more years of experience. German defensive positions were better constructed. German camouflage was superior. German counterattacks were faster and more precisely coordinated. But the German rifle company was hungry. It was tired. It was infested with lice. Its men had not bathed in weeks. Its replacements were teenagers or men in their 40s who had been scraped from the bottom of the manpower barrel. Its ammunition supply was uncertain. Its food supply was unreliable. Its horses were dying of exhaustion and disease. Its vehicles, when it had vehicles, were running on captured fuel and breaking down because replacement parts had stopped arriving from factories that were being bombed around the clock. And the American rifle company it was facing had eaten a hot breakfast that morning, was wearing clean socks, had slept under a roof the night before, had dry ammunition in reliable quantities, and knew that if any man in the company was wounded, a medical system with plasma, sulfur drugs, and functioning hospitals was waiting behind the lines to save his life. The German company was harder, the American company was stronger, and strength, it turned out, outlasted hardness every single time, because hardness is a finite resource. A man can be hard for a day, for a week, for a month. Eventually, the body breaks. And when the body breaks, no amount of willpower, no amount of Härte, no amount of ideological commitment can put it back together. Strength is different. Strength is renewable. You can restore it with a hot meal and 8 hours of sleep and a pair of dry socks, and the Americans had built a system that renewed their soldiers' strength every single day. There is a moment in every war when the losing side begins to understand that it is losing, not because of a single battle or a single mistake, but because of something structural, something built into the nature of the opponent that cannot be matched by trying harder. For the German army, that moment came gradually across the autumn and winter of 1944, and it was captured most clearly not in the official reports, but in the private conversations of captured senior officers. At Trent Park, a converted manor house in North London, British intelligence held captured German generals from 1942 until the end of the war. The Germans believed Trent Park was a comfortable prison. The food was decent. There were books and chess sets and walks in the garden. The windows looked out on green lawns. What the Germans did not know was that every room, including the bedrooms, was wired for sound. British intelligence officers, many of them German-speaking Jewish refugees who had fled the Reich and were now listening to the men who had destroyed their world, sat in a basement and transcribed everything the generals said to each other when they thought they were alone. The transcripts from Trent Park and a related American facility at Fort Hunt in Virginia run to roughly 150,000 pages combined. They are among the most valuable sources we have for what senior German military men actually believed, as opposed to what they wrote in their carefully edited post-war memoirs. In those transcripts, the question of why the war was going wrong came up repeatedly. And while much of the conversation focused on tactics, on Hitler's interference, on the Eastern Front, on the bombing campaign, the theme of American material abundance surfaced again and again, in a tone that the transcribers noted was closer to bafflement than anger. What the captured generals kept circling back to was not simply that the Americans had more of everything. They had expected that. The German intelligence services had studied American industrial capacity before the war and had concluded, correctly, that if the war lasted long enough, American production would overwhelm German production. What they had not expected was that American commanders would treat supply not as a secondary concern to be delegated to quartermasters and forgotten, but as a primary weapon to be aimed at the enemy just as deliberately as artillery. The American logistics system did not just keep soldiers alive, it kept them fighting. And it kept them fighting at a level that German soldiers, who were individually more experienced and often individually more skilled, could not sustain because their own bodies were failing them. German officers in Allied captivity described repeatedly what it was like to fight an enemy who seemed to live better in combat than German troops lived in garrison. One recurring observation in prisoner interviews was the discovery of hot coffee in American foxholes, not cold coffee from a canteen, hot coffee, in insulated containers, in foxholes. Officers who had overrun American positions during local counterattacks reported finding positions dug with an attention to comfort that no German unit bothered with. Drainage channels. Overhead cover made from salvaged timber. In some cases, small shelves cut into the dirt walls for personal items. The Americans, as one prisoner put it, seemed to be living in their foxholes as if they intended to be comfortable in them. As if comfort were something they expected even in a hole in the ground with an enemy 100 meters away. German armored officers made a related observation about tank crews. American tankers appeared to be fresher, more alert, and faster in their reactions than German crews after the same number of days in continuous combat. German officers attributed this not to superior training but to the fact that the Americans were sleeping in dry clothes, eating cooked food, and rotating through rest areas that the German army could not provide. German tank crews, by contrast, were sleeping in or under their vehicles, eating cold rations when rations arrived at all, and wearing the same uniforms they had been wearing for weeks. German gunners were making errors by the third day of continuous operations that they would not have made on the first day. Errors caused not by lack of skill but by exhaustion, by cold, by hunger, by the body betraying the will. German prisoners of war in American camps were frequently astonished by their treatment. Men who had been told by their own propaganda that the Americans would abuse or execute them instead found themselves in facilities where the food was often better than what the Wehrmacht had been serving them. In camps across Oklahoma and Texas, Afrika Korps veterans received meals that included fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee, rations that were, in some cases, more generous than what American civilians were eating under rationing. This had a measurable effect on German willingness to surrender. As the war progressed and word filtered back through the front lines that American captivity was survivable and even tolerable, the incentive for a German soldier to fight to the death diminished. The hot meals and clean beds in an American prisoner of war camp were, in their own way, as much a weapon as the artillery shells that drove the prisoners into captivity in the first place. The pre-war German stereotype of Americans as soft, as money-grubbing, as too comfortable to produce real warriors was the central miscalculation of the European war. It was not just wrong, it was exactly backwards. The Americans were comfortable because comfort was a weapon. They were well-fed because food was ammunition. They were clean because hygiene was a force multiplier. The softness the Germans mocked was the hardest thing on the battlefield because it could be sustained. Willpower runs out. Hot coffee does not, if you have the ships and the trucks and the factories and the organizational will to keep it coming. So here is the verdict on the question that German prisoners kept asking on roads across France and Belgium and Germany. Why were the Americans taking hot baths in the middle of a war? Because a hot bath was not a bath. A hot bath was a statement. It said, we have enough water, enough fuel, enough trucks, enough people, enough industrial capacity, enough organizational competence, enough national wealth. And we have something else too. We have a belief that you, the man standing in line holding a towel, matter, not as a weapon, not as a resource to be used up, as a person, and persons need to be clean and warm and fed and rested, because that is what persons are. The German army had a different statement. Its statement said, you do not need comfort, you need will, and when your will is not enough, you need more will, and when more will is not enough, you need Härte, hardness, the ability to absorb punishment that would break a lesser man. The problem with that statement is that it is a lie, not a deliberate lie. The men who believed it were sincere. Rommel was sincere when he shared his men's hardships. The German NCO who went hungry alongside his squad was sincere. But the underlying premise that willpower can substitute indefinitely for food, sleep, hygiene, and medical care is physically, medically, and psychologically false. The body has limits. Willpower does not extend those limits. It only delays the moment when the man hits them, and when a man hits them, he does not become harder. He becomes a casualty. The American army understood this, not because it was wiser than the German army, but because it came from a country that had spent a century building machines and had learned, the hard way, on factory floors and railroad lines and construction sites, that the machine runs better when you maintain it. A soldier was a machine. A magnificent, irreplaceable human machine, but a machine nonetheless, and you maintained the machine by giving it what it needed: hot food, clean clothes, dry socks, medical care, rest, a hot shower. The honest verdict is not that the American army was better than the Wehrmacht. In many narrow military measures, it was not. German tactical training was superior. German small unit leadership was superior. German equipment in several categories was superior. The 75mm gun on the Sherman tank was inferior to the 88mm gun on the Tiger. German optics were better. German machine guns were better. German doctrine was, on paper, more sophisticated. But the American system was stronger. It was stronger because it was sustainable. It was sustainable because it treated the human being inside the uniform as the most important component of the weapon, not the least important. It was sustainable because it had an industrial base that could build 2,700 Liberty ships and fill them with everything from artillery shells to Coca-Cola. And it was sustainable because the culture behind it, the culture of management and engineering and problem-solving, never lost sight of the fact that the man at the end of the supply chain was not a number. He was a person, and persons, unlike abstractions like Härte and martial spirit, have physical needs. Every fact in this investigation is documented. The 859th Fumigation and Bath Company at Homburg-Haut was real. The 8 miles from the front line was real. Corporal Benjamin Berry and the 863rd Fumigation and Bath Company were real. The 64 Coca-Cola bottling plants were real. The 5 billion bottles were real. The Red Ball Express and its 12,342 tons in a single day were real. Rommel's warning to Bayerlein about an enemy that spared no expenditure of material was real. The unnamed German prisoner who looked at an American supply dump and said they had piled up the supplies and let them fall was real. His name was never recorded, but his words were. Most of the men who ran the shower trailers and the laundry trucks and the bakery ovens and the water purification units are not in the history books. They did not storm beaches. They did not knock out machine gun nests. They did not receive medals for valor. They received the quiet gratitude of men who walked into a canvas enclosure in a field covered in mud and lice and walked out clean, holding a towel and a fresh uniform, feeling for the first time in weeks like a human being instead of an animal. That was the weapon the Germans could not understand. It was not a weapon that killed. It was a weapon that kept men alive. It kept them alert. It kept them sane. It kept them believing that the country they were fighting for had not forgotten them, that someone behind the lines was counting the socks and heating the water and driving the trucks through the night to make sure that tomorrow morning there would be hot coffee in the foxhole. The Germans looked across the lines and saw luxury. They saw softness. They saw waste. They saw an army that did not take war seriously because it was taking showers. What they were actually seeing was the most serious army on earth, an army that had figured out something the army of Frederick the Great and Moltke and Rommel had never fully understood. That the objective of a military is not to produce the hardest soldier. It is to produce the last soldier standing, and the last soldier standing will not be the one with the strongest will. He will be the one with the cleanest socks, the fullest stomach, and the belief, earned by 1,000 small acts of institutional care, that the system behind him will not let him fall. Those German prisoners stood on those roads and asked their question. Why are they doing this? Why are they wasting resources on comfort when there is a war to fight? 80 years later, we have the answer. They were not wasting resources, they were investing them. Every gallon of hot water, every clean undershirt, every pound of fresh bread, every bottle of Coca-Cola, every insulated can of hot coffee carried forward on a jeep to a foxhole at dawn. Every one of those things was a deposit in a bank account the Germans could not see, an account that paid out in alertness and resilience and endurance and the will to keep fighting, not because a doctrine manual said to, but because a man who has been treated like a human being will fight like one. That was the secret. The Germans never broke it because there was nothing to break. There was no code. There was no trick. There was just an army, an imperfect, sometimes wasteful, sometimes inefficient army, that had decided somewhere in its institutional soul that the man in the foxhole was worth a hot shower. And that decision, repeated millions of times across thousands of miles of supply chain, was the weight that fell on the Wehrmacht and crushed it. Not bullets, not bombs, not tanks, supplies, piled up, as the prisoner said, and then let fall. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this story reach the people who care about getting the history right. Not the history that makes us comfortable, not the history that reduces millions of men to a footnote, but the history that actually happened, with the names and the details and the shower trailers and the laundry trucks and the quiet men who kept them running. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men in ordinary uniforms who never fired a shot but whose work kept an army in the field and won a war. They had names. They came from somewhere. They drove the trucks and heated the water and folded the uniforms and served the coffee. And they deserve to be remembered for the thing about them that the Germans, standing on a road in France with their mouths open, could never quite explain.